Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Angel. Today we're going to be doing some Victorian Storybook Christmas DIYs. For this first project, I found some more of these 80s style little ceramic plaques in the wood pieces, and I'm gonna make these over for a Christmas Carol DIY. To start out, the first thing I'm doing is just painting over that orange wood with some burnt umber brown paint, and I'm just carefully going around the edges of that ceramic piece, trying not to get this paint on those. For the actual centerpieces, I did paint these with 2 coats of Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. And instead of taping these, I just used a piece of cardstock around the edge of the little round piece. That way I wouldn't get this paint on the outside. For the first one I'm doing, I just made this little A Christmas Carol book page. It's the first book page from the book, and I just made this in Canva, and then I traced it out on a sheet of paper, and I'm using some carbon paper, and I'm gonna transfer this onto that center ceramic piece. So I'm just using the little tool that came with my carbon paper, and I'm just gonna trace over all of that. For the other one, I'm just using this little silhouette of Scrooge. I actually have this on my blog if you'd like to download it. I will leave a link in the description box below, but I did the exact same thing for this one, just traced over it with my carbon paper onto the other plaque. Now for the first one I did of the title page of the book, I ended up having to use artistry markers to fill this in because the script was so tiny that if I would have used my paint markers, it would have smeared or blurred the words. So I just ended up using black and red in those markers that I got from Michael's. And then I wanted to add a few little stamps to this as well. So I'm using some of my red archival ink and doing a few stamps. And then I also used my black archival ink to do a top and bottom. For the Scrooge silhouette, I just used my black paint markers, and then I ended up filling this in just with a very small paintbrush and some of my black chalk paint. For my next project, this is another wood plaque that I found at the thrift store, and I really wanted to make a Nutcracker Blueprint. So the first thing I'm doing is just going around the edges of this plaque and painting it with some of my black chalk paint. I wasn't really being neat about it because I intend to paint the center part in just a little bit, but before I do that, I wanted to make the outside edges look bronzed or brass. So I went over it with some of my European Gold Rub and Buff, and then once it was dried a little bit, then I kind of did tape off the edges. You can see here I just used little pieces of masking tape to tape it, and then I painted it with 2 coats of that plaster color with Waverly chalk paint. Now instead of transferring my Nutcracker image straight onto this, I actually traced a Nutcracker image onto a piece of tissue paper, and I'm gonna Mod Podge this down to that little plaque. The reason I did this is because as I'm doing this, I'm actually gonna try to make a few wrinkles in this. You can see I'm using my fingers and spreading it out, and I'm actually pushing wrinkles into this because I want it to look old and aged, and like a piece of a blueprint was matted to this plaque. Now, I ended up doing this Nutcracker Blueprint in 2 different steps, but I'm actually going to put this on the blog as the full image with the Nutcracker and the blueprint around it. Once the top coat of Mod Podge was all dry, then I went in with a black colored pencil and a brown colored pencil, and I shaded in my Nutcracker. Then I created the actual blueprint part of this. You can see I sketched it out, and then I made the rest of this in Photoshop to put over the Nutcracker, and I just taped it down with some of my carbon paper, and then I'm tracing over it with that little tool that I got to add the blueprint. And then I just left it like this without going back over the wording from the blueprint. This next project is going back to A Christmas Carol. I had this shadow box from the thrift store, so I wanted to make some little silhouette Christmas carolers. Now you're going to see me paint this brown, but I ended up really not liking the frame painted brown for this particular project. So I do end up painting both of my little frames for this shadow box with some white chalk paint. For the backing piece that's going to go on top of that smaller frame in the shadow box, I'm just using a thick piece of chipboard. And I'm going to start out by painting this with one coat of my acrylic red paint in the color Barn Red. Once that was dry, I'm going to use my Tim Holtz brick stencil and some white chalk paint, and I'm just going to stencil these bricks as the background. Once I had the first side done, then I just lined up my stencil to do the other side. Then for the carolers, I again have this on my blog of these little caroler silhouettes. I traced them out onto a piece of paper, and I also wanted to add this street lamp to the center of them. So I'm going to transfer these actually in layers onto this background. I'm starting with that lamp post and using some carbon paper to trace it onto here. And then once I have the street lamp on there, then I will layer the Christmas carolers on top of there. Then I'm going to start this time with the carolers, and I'm going to trace around that image with my black paint markers. I'm going to fill in the small details with that black paint marker, but I do end up painting the rest of it in with a small paintbrush and some of my black chalk paint. Once I had the carolers done, then I was able to go back in with my black paint marker and do the street lamp. And for the holly and the berries that were on the street lamp, again, I just used a small paintbrush and some paint to fill those in. Then to finish this off, I just glued down that backing piece on top of the second frame and then layered the large frame back on top. I also decided to add some red velvet ribbon to the top of it. I had this old wood box in my stash, so I decided to use this to do a Christmas Carol decoration. The first thing I'm doing is just taking this outside, and I'm gonna spray paint this with some Rust-Oleum Champagne Bronze spray paint. Then once again, I created this Scrooge and Marley counting house little graphic in Photoshop, and I'm gonna use my carbon paper to trace this on top of the box. I'll also be sure to put these on the blog if you're interested in creating your own. I also created another piece for the front of the box that just says Bah Humbug with a little design around it, and I did the exact same thing, just transferring it with my carbon paper. Then I just used my black paint marker to go back over the top of the box to start with, and then I finished it on the front side as well. Then to finish this box off, I'm adding these cute little vintage feet that I got from Amazon to the bottom of the box. For this final project, I obviously had to make a clock for Christmas, and I wanted to make one for the Nutcracker. So I found this one at the thrift store and decided to make this kind of into a Mackenzie Childs inspired Nutcracker clock. So the first thing I'm doing is just painting this entire clock with 2 coats of my black chalk paint. Then I taped off that top piece, and I'm going to go in around the rim of the top of the clock with some of my European gold rub and buff. I did consider doing the black and white checkered like Mackenzie Childs, but in the end I just decided to go for gold and black. Now, I only had the thicker painter's tape and was having a little trouble trying to make the checkered pattern on the top of here. So I just ended up doing some smaller squares on the sides and in the center, and then did some larger squares with some masking tape in the center of this. So even though my squares are not all even, it does look purposeful and ended up fitting nicely. Now this clock had an old ceramic clock face, and I wanted to cover that up obviously with a nutcracker. So I found this print off of Etsy and just downloaded it and had it printed off in the size that I needed from Walgreens. And then I'm just going to use some school glue and a sponge brush and smooth out that glue and attach this to the clock face. Then I just used some scissors to poke the hole through the center to fit the clock mechanism. But before I added the clock hands back, I did go over those with some European gold rub and buff. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.